I've got just 3 talents: recreating Star Wars vehicles in Minecraft with obsessive attention to detail, utilizing complex commands to terraform unique landscapes, and never ever going outside. Sounds like the perfect skill set for building massive Star Wars dioramas, right? So let's kick things off with the opening skirmish of the Clone Wars, the Battle of Geonosis. The Republic brought in their troops using acclamator-class assault ships, so while I create a wireframe for one of those, let me give you the game plan. Inside the hangars of these transport ships, I'll assemble the Republic's vehicles. Then I'll recreate the harsh Geonosian terrain and its notorious arena, which will be used as battlegrounds against the CIS forces. And to top it off, I'll bring everything to life with mods that allow me to control the ships and armies. Trust me, you don't want to miss this. I'm building my acclamator at a scale of 1 block to 1 meter, which means maths. I know, terrifying. If you're attempting a project like this, I'd recommend following a 3D model as a reference and calculating ratios from there. For the true nerds, you can print off images of the ship and work out the proportions by hand. Couldn't be me though. The odd angles are a nightmare, but it can't get any harder than this, right? It sure can. In the end, you start to lose faith in the calculations you've made, and you begin eyeballing everything. Don't worry, that's just part of the process. So, that only took like 11 hours, but it was a worthy investment because now all I have to do is fill in the shapes. I'm using the Loft tool from the Archeon plugin to magic up each face. Admittedly, it's doing a lot of work for me. Just know that I'm skipping over most of the touch-ups done by hand because it's rather boring. At the bow, I decided to have a go at detailing, setting the standard for the rest of the ship. Without Loft, shaping the stern would have taken a month, but I did it in an hour. The bridge had a very tricky egg shape, and I probably made it slightly too big, but oh well, more space for interior. Star Wars fans, check out this size comparison. So I did some building off camera. Nah, I totally already had one of these, but seeing the Venator alongside at scale is kinda crazy. The Republic forces are coming along well, but that's just one part of my vision. I drew up a plan where each grid square is 100 blocks wide, which includes the placement of mountains, a flying acclamator and a landed variant, the Geonosian arena, core ships, and the battle scenes themselves. Yeah, this'll probably be enough space. I used the GoBrush plugin to elevate the terrain for the mountain's bases, and then built out the steeper slopes using the Angled Cliff Meta brush. After like 4 hours of doing that, I could just apply a smoothing command to tidy things up. Now, attempting to smooth all 300 million blocks at once would crash the server for everyone. Please don't ask how I know that. So I did it in stages, and watching all of the chunks update was incredibly satisfying. Next, I needed the perfect block palette to recreate this look. The best thing to have would be a color wheel containing every single block, sorted into gradients in every direction, and I really don't have time for. So here's the omnidirectional color wheel that I made. I can pull gradients from it just by going for a stroll. Pretty neat. This made it super easy to pick out some nice palettes, and I textured the mountains by angle, using the more vibrant colors on the flat sandy regions and duller textures on the rocky slopes. Between the mountains, I used 2 layers of Archeon's Terragen tool, which makes fancy terrain out of noise patterns, to create sandy dunes over a rocky basement. I think this looks amazing, but it's obviously missing the distinctive Geonosian spires, and we'll tackle those later. Returning to the acclamator, my first task was to reshape the top of this red section to match the reference. My Venator's hull ended up looking pretty flat, so for this ship I wanted to add some large panels inspired by the model. On top of these panels I could add smaller details and minor texture variation. After adding depth and detail to the center, I outlined the ship's red stripes on the dorsal wings. The main problem I faced was the awkward intersections between the panels on the slopes, and that made paneling the steep corner section impossible, so I settled for some textured lines. One of my favourite parts of this build is the detail I added to the flat section below the bridge, as, without any spooky slopes to hinder me, I was actually able to build properly. I was going to add windows to the bridge, but after researching I discovered that acclamators don't have any. instead relying on advanced hollow screens within, making it much safer for the crew. All of that paneling work completely transformed the ship, but after 8 hours of it, I needed a break. It's Spire time, and that means introducing the newest building tool on the block, Easy Edits. Massively oversimplifying, Easy Edits is an extension of World Edit that streamlines complex expression-based commands. For example, you can make basically any shape with one command, but also any shape made out of any shape with another. It also adds smoothing, splines, or cool curvy things as I like to call them, magic texturing, and custom noise, to name but a few features. To make my spires I needed a spike, a bead spline, basically a tower of spheres, and a noise spline with a high twist parameter to add some random variation. Then, layering those on top of one another, I merged them with an easy smooth command, weighted in the y-axis, fixed each one up by hand, and applied an ambient easy texture, which, given a certain palette, sets blocks based on the amount of surrounding air. And if you have no idea what I just said, I'm halfway there with you and I'm the one doing it. But I think that we can all agree that the end result is pretty damn accurate. So now we can just slap them onto the terrain and we've got ourselves a planetary scene. But we won't have a battle without this acclamator, so let's get back to it. After paneling and detailing the stern, I had a go at making the main engines. Reusing my method from the Venator, I measured out the sections of the engine with different radii, positioned them in Minecraft as different size cylinders, and then rotated the whole thing to get a base shape. The nozzle itself required building struts that had the same shape vertically, horizontally, and diagonally, leading me to implement some pretty unique shaping blocks like levers. Somehow it just works when you zoom out, and the shaders give an incredibly realistic blow that just looks so good. The smaller engines were less time consuming, but that doesn't mean I slacked on the shaping. These medium-sized thrusters help with turning the ship, but I really don't know why there are tiny ones down here. I wasn't a fan of the rest of the details on the model I was referencing, so I found a new one, but I could only view it in Blender, so after watching 3 tutorials and having the program crash 4 times, I was able to open the file. That's classic Blender apparently. Using this model as a rough guideline, I employed a technique called greebling. I know it sounds like some kind of abstract curse word, but it just describes the idea of adding lots of small shapes to make a surface feel more technological. Physical designers would recycle waste plastic parts and add them to the models in this way for old movies, like the Star Destroyer in the original trilogy, helping to sell the scale of those vehicles. For my Venator, I added the greebles via a string of commands, so to one-up that I had to do these ones by hand, which was surprisingly fun to grind out for about 8 hours, and definitely resulted in some incredibly satisfying time lapses here. I even added a pair of heavy proton torpedo tubes on each side, the acclamator's strongest form of weaponry. And speaking of weapons, I added several turbo lasers below the bridge, as well as within the hull trench, which could be used to defend against enemy starfighters. Moving on to the underside, and the authentication servers are down. Thanks Xbox. No server means no building. Play.bakery.builders if you're looking for a plot server, by the way. So it's an early night, I guess. The next morning, I successfully moved on to the underside, paneling the flat areas and detailing the central red section down to the area around the ventral doors. That marked a completed exterior, but before I could begin the interior, I needed some Republic vehicles. According to my research, the acclamator carried up to 320 bark speeder bikes. The highlights of my design are probably the candles as handlebars and the open fence gate as footrests. I already had a design for the Republic gunship. It's slightly upscaled in order to get the proper shapes, but don't tell anyone. My favourite parts of this design are the melons, just to get a nice green texture, the cobweb to recreate the Republic's emblem, and the balls, that are actually accessible in survival mode. Likewise, I already had an ATTE, similarly scaled with some very intricate leg designs and just enough space for a small interior. Here's a quick 10-second tutorial for it, layer by layer. The dimensions are 21 by 11 by 9.5. You're welcome. This ATTE then fits snugly into my LAATC design, allowing the walkers to be flown onto our future battlefield. But there's one more walker that needs to be built, the self-propelled heavy artillery, with its massive turbo laser capable of taking down enemy core ships. I brought in my friend Benji to help create such a large vehicle, and over the course of about 6 hours we were able to put together an incredibly smooth design, utilizing walls, glass panes, slabs and carpets to mirror its bulbous and curving shapes. It was difficult to find accurate dimensions online, so we eyeballed its length relative to the ATTE. So Benji, how did you find building such a unique, and he's made tiny versions. With the vehicles ready, I could begin work on the interior, first positioning the main reactor and then blocking out the staging area. I snuck in a level below where the main hangars will be for some extra ATTE bays. Following the official cross-section as a guide, I built pipes from the reactor to the main engines and added a hyperdrive generator nestled into the stern. Forward from the reactor, I designed a fuel system made up of several short silos and a network of intake piping. Copying the design from below, I installed many more bays for the walkers and then placed the gunships on ceiling racks, with spaces towards the center for the larger SPHAs. This area was mirrored into the other wing, with large vehicle lifts connecting the hangars to the staging area below. The lifts obviously don't work without create mod or clever time-lapses, but I still ensured that they could fit the largest vehicles, for realism. Any gaps left were filled in with the Bark speeder bikes, including an entire room adjacent to the staging area, so that I could attempt to meet the apparent quota of 320. Then I added depth to the previously boring interior walls and brought the hangars to life with various assets for cargo, transport and refueling. I made some ammo crates out of netherite blocks just to make the survival players upset. I could have added more rooms for the clone barracks, mess halls and so on, but I had already sunk about 10 hours into the interior and I think you guys would appreciate a healthy upload schedule. I did, however, design the command center and bridge with its many advanced hollow screens, linked to the hangars via elevators. I think that this will make an excellent space for role-playing with friends. The Confederacy of Independent Systems will need a sizable droid army to combat against the Republic, starting with the Hailfire droid, or the Roly Boy as I like to call it. This droid required slanted circles that act as large tracks, and a lot of missiles, which I replicated using end rods and fence gates. Then I designed a homing spider droid, building long legs out of various wall blocks, a seriously smooth central ball using walls, panes and levers, and laser cannons out of grindstones and chains. I love this vehicle because it's absolutely packed with detail. The dwarf spider droid was the homing's little cousin, and I was forced to make the design at twice actual scaled size, just so that I could properly replicate the eye details. At least it will be recognizable on the battlefield. And an honorable mention goes to the Nantex-class Territorial Defense Starfighter, which wasn't actually a droid, but operated by a Geonosian pilot. You can grab this CIS vehicle pack as a free download on my Patreon, and that's also where you'll find downloads for the Acclamator, Venator, and the upcoming Geonosis scene, available through membership or individual purchase. Thank you so much to my current supporters. Speaking of Geonosis, it's time to build that arena. I was really surprised to find a 3D model that I could use as a reference. It was admittedly inaccurate, but it made me a lot more confident to give the structure a go. After layering concentric spectator stands, I added details such as the execution pillars, guard towers, entrances, and awnings. Since the arena was built out of an existing formation carved by millions of years of erosion, I recreated the natural terrain using an Archeon boulder brush, fashioning rocky overhangs with large openings for sunlight. Like the previous terraforming, I textured it by angle and then added the final upper details. Benji had recently watched the prequels, so he suggested that I include the 3 arena beasts. Following this excellent idea, I started with the Reek, a large rhinoceros-like herbivore that became red, angry, and carnivorous when starved. It was a rare opportunity to use ore blocks for texturing, and a fun challenge overall. Next up, the Acklay, a 6-legged, 3-eyed mantis-like predator with traits of both crustaceans and reptiles. These creatures could hunt on land and in the sea, and they were apparently able to sense electric fields like sharks. Completing the trio, we have the Nexu, an agile cat-like omnivore with a defensive mane of sharp quills. forked tails, and 2 pairs of eyes, the second pair giving them infrared vision. I think these all turned out amazing, and so did the arena itself, blending into the landscape with its spires atop. Before I could place the acclamators into my scene, I needed to make a landed variant. Below the staging area, Hollow stored dual rear landing gear, with the hull able to open up and let them extend. Unfortunately, these legs required building on the diagonal, but at this point I was pretty used to that. Likewise, below the bow, I added another void to store the forward landing gear. Since this leg was in the center and only needed to be angled in one axis, I built it straight, rotated it backwards, smoothed out the shapes, and then connected it to the same foot design from the rear. Now the acclamator was properly finished, with both the flying and landed variant ready to be pasted into the terrain. I know that they aren't supposed to have the red paint jobs yet, but I really like red. Can you tell? Returning to the CIS forces, it was time to go big, and that meant digging a giant hole to act as the core ship's launch shaft. These vessels were apparently over 900 meters tall, forcing me to scale down the design by 3 times to fit it within Minecraft's height limit. I considered this ship to be more of a background prop, which does sound silly for a vehicle of this size, and therefore I didn't add too much detail, instead focusing on the shaping of the towers and dishes. To complete the build, I textured it with a cellular noise pattern, and then copied across a second ship closer to the arena at a different height and rotation. From all the way down here, it's crazy to think that these are supposed to be 3 times larger. And finally, we need the hard cell class, which I scaled down to the core ship. At first, I thought that these were just fuel storages for the larger ships, but apparently they're interstellar transports, outfitted with Class 1 hyperdrives. After I detailed that, it was just a case of dotting them around the core ships. And now I could bring everything together, creating a line of walkers streaming out of the acclamator and establishing a front line. Then I added Republic gunships to provide aerial support, and carriers bringing ATTEs to the battlefield. Opposing them, I positioned the various droid vehicles in waves, and Geonosian starfighters above. Then I detailed the fighting with freeze-frame laser fire, with massive bursts coming from the SPHAs towards the looming core ship. Wow, I would not want to be caught in the middle of all this. I did promise some modded action at the start, so here I'm using Eureka ships for Valkyrian skies to add physics to my gunship. I'll be honest though, it tends to glitch out, especially on larger vehicles, so let me know in the comments what other mods I can try. Being able to fly the gunship out of the acclamator and towards the arena was incredible however, so I can't complain too much. I'm also using a relatively new Clone Wars mod by Simply Melonhaver, providing a bunch of Star Wars assets and mobs. I know these clones are canonically wrong here, but my mod version doesn't have the default phase 1s yet, so sue me. On second thought, maybe I shouldn't say that. Let's drop off these clones. Ah yes, just like the movies. I also spawned in armies on either side of the battlefield and observed the war that commenced, actually ensuring that the clones won this time. But with that silliness out of the way, let's explore the finished product. I present the Battle of Geonosis in Minecraft. I think that the time investment was worth it, but I'm obviously biased. Since you've made it this far, please consider annihilating that subscribe button, if you haven't already, and let me know what you want to see next. Thanks for watching.